Hey everybody, this is Kevin for another episode of Lazy Literature. In my last episode, I reviewed, but I didn't recommend that anybody read Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Maybe you followed my recommendations and you watched the movies Idiocracy, followed by The Matrix, and that roughly would have been my experience reading Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. For this week, everybody, I'm gonna review and highly recommend Our Man by George Packer because it's a really good nonfiction book that you should read. And I think it's an important biography to read about a statesman or an American diplomat like Richard Holbrooke. As I go through this, excuse me if I mix up George Packer and Richard Holbrooke's names. As I was going through and talking about this book to other people, being annoying in real life with my reading habits, I was constantly mixing up those names. I was constantly saying George Holbrook and Richard Packer, and I don't quite know why I was doing that, but hopefully that won't happen for this video. George Packer is a very good writer. Most of the time throughout the work week, he is a staff writer at the Atlantic. He's written at the Atlantic for a very long time, and he writes a lot of really good stories, articles, and essays for the Atlantic. And traditionally, for his topics, he'll go from anything like him and his wife trying to find an appropriate school for their kid in New York City, all the way to a 500-page biography of the American diplomat Richard Holbrooke. Now, to go into Our Man by George Packer a little bit more, I highly recommend that everybody read this book because I think it gives people easy to understand insight about what it's like to be a professional public servant in the United States. And, sometimes when we think about these people, we create myths for what we think they're really like. And over 500 pages, George Packer does a pretty good job, in my opinion, of showing people what Richard Holbrooke was really like. And in my own words, and I've borrowed a few of these from George Packer, Richard Holbrooke was a great man. He was very successful in his field of working as a U.S. diplomat, but at the same time, he was vain and he was pretty rude and he was mean to people. And at the end of his life, when he was working with the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, he didn't always do a great job working with other people. But Richard Holbrooke has quickly become one of those figures from history where you could take a look at all of his objective accomplishments. He spent years of his life working as a U.S. diplomat in Vietnam. That's where he got his start during the Vietnam War. After that, the guy did a little bit of everything before going back to being a U.S. diplomat. When this guy got back from Vietnam, he worked in the private sector and banking for a little bit. He tried to climb the ladder in Washington, D.C., working as a U.S. diplomat. And then one day, eventually, Richard Holbrooke wanted to be the Secretary of State for the United States. But because of this guy's personality and his unwillingness to work with other people, Richard Holbrooke managed to accomplish some great things without ever really rising to the station that he wanted out of his professional life. And I think it's important to read Our Man by George Packer because he really shows the frustrations that Richard Holbrooke went through. Richard Holbrooke was vain and he had a very high opinion about himself. If you take a look at his own writings and the way he communicated with other people. And I mean, I guess you need people who are just going to go out there and get things done, but you still have to collaborate and you still have to have teammates. And the thing about Richard Holbrooke, as you go through and you read Our Man by George Packer, is that I think readers get a feeling that no matter how many great diplomatic and international accomplishments can be attributed to Richard Holbrooke, the guy didn't get along with other people, ironically enough, and he pushed people away, and he went through multiple marriages, and he committed infidelity because that's what he was feeling at the time. And, you know, our man, Richard Holbrooke, he might have been a part of the Vietnam War. He might have worked in the private sector, in banking. He might have been involved in helping Indonesia calm down on East Timor. He might have tried to be involved in unifying Cyprus. But more than anything else, what a lot of people remember about Richard Holbrooke is his involvement in the Bosnian and Serbian War. And to be honest, I was born in 1993, so I knew about the Bosnian Serbian conflict, but I didn't fully understand it when I first heard about it, and now I understand it slightly more because I recognize the role that Richard Holbrooke played in at least trying to broker a peace deal between the three major groups that were involved in that conflict. And a good portion of Our Man by George Packer, it talks about how Richard Holbrooke spent more than a couple of years of his life going to Eastern Europe, going to Bosnia, Croatia, and Albania, all those tricky little countries that are right across the map from Italy. And he tried to end this conflict that was killing thousands of people. It was forcing people out of their homes. And the Bosnian War, to use a simple term, is hard for a lot of people to talk about because it really was a genocide that happened in the 1990s. And it's a lot more recent than some people might like to admit. And it was one of those tricky instances in the history of the world where America was in a position to where, in my opinion, we should have been involved and we should have stopped it, just because you can't have people dying and countries failing in Eastern Europe. But more than anything else, it was this big, messy problem halfway around the world, and America had to try and figure out its role in it. And the person who was doing that for us was Richard Holbrooke. Ironically enough, he would end his career at the twilight of his life, focusing on Afghanistan and Iraq for the war in the Middle East. But to wrap up this video, everybody, go out, read, buy, rent, borrow Our Man, the biography of Richard Holbrooke by George Packer. It's really good. It gives you a lot of insight into important moments in American history. And I think it does a good job of showing you a very influential person who's not a perfect person. And as a result, it took them a long time to understand that. And Richard Holbrooke, for everything great that he did, it's kind of ironic because his own unwillingness to work with other people as an American diplomat is what held his career back. Next week, everybody, I'm going to be taking a look at 2 books. I think one is by Nick Hornby. Pretty sure it's High Fidelity. That's what I'm reading now. The book that was the John Cusack movie, and now it's this excellent series on Hulu. And then also by next Monday, I was going to read a little Hunter S. Thompson. And, next Monday, might be talking about books, might be talking about young men and masculinity, or anything in between. We've got a pretty rainy Monday here outside my apartment, so I'm going to go ahead and keep on getting ready for the day, and I hope all of you had a good day as you go about your lives, living, reading, or anything else in between.